And YouTube goes right away, like there's no delay at all. So YouTube is much more reliable. It's just it doesn't have the same audience. So now I got to get the link.
It goes right away, like there's no delay at all.
I got to mute that. Okay, now I've got to get the link so that I can share it. Copy video URL. Okay. Now I have to share it on Facebook so that people on Facebook can see it, and then we'll be good to go. Okay. So now we are connected to Facebook. We're live on YouTube. And let me get on here and share the text of Samuel, and we will then be good to go. Okay, so here we are, chapter 7. So do you want to lead us off here, Linda?
Okay. Let's see. The men of Kiryat Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it into the house of Abinadab on the hill. And they consecrated his son Eleazar to have charge of the ark of the Lord. A long time elapsed from the day that the ark was housed in Kiryat Jearim, 20 years in all, and all the house of Israel yearned after the Lord. We need to move it up. Thank you. And Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you mean to return to the Lord with all your heart, you must remove the alien gods and the Ashtaroth from your midst and direct your heart to the Lord and serve him alone. Then he will deliver you from the hands of the Philistines.
Okay, so you know, one of the things that we see throughout all our texts are foreign gods and Ashtaroth. Now, Ashtaroth have to do with Asherah or Astarte, Ishtar. It's the same goddess, the goddess of fertility, and we know that the Israelites worshipped, Asherah all the way until at least the 7th century. It seems that that's in many places they may have become monolatrist in the 7th century when Josiah buried the shrines, and then they become monotheist after they returned from Babylonia. So when they're worshiping Asherah pretty much everywhere, probably up until the mid 7th century. That's the guess, and maybe Jerusalem stopped in 701. That's the date that I look to for the time when the Israelites are really monolatristic, is the siege of Jerusalem as being the historical event in which they decided that worship of foreign gods is the cause of the fall of the north, and that they needed to worship Adonai alone, and then that's when the change happens. So you can kind of date the importance of these stories to that point. Okay.
Okay, and the Israelites removed the Baalim and the Ashtaroth, and they served the Lord alone. Samuel said, assemble all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. They assembled at Mizpah, and they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. They fasted that day, and there they confessed that they had sinned against the Lord, and Samuel acted as chieftain of the Israelites at Mizpah.
Okay, so what we've got here is this idea that when the ark is gone, the people are worshiping other divine beings. Okay, so that it's possible that is a reference to a later point in time when the ark is gone. and the idea is that the people should come back to worship Adonai or they're going to have problems. I don't know. But either way, they're worshiping other other divine beings. And Samuel is now chieftain of the Israelites at Mizpah. Okay, here we go.
And
Keep going.
is there a place today that we know was Mizpah?
I think there's some guesses as to where Mizpah is. I think there's even a place in Israel called Mizpah. I don't know that we know for sure that it's this Mizpah. Yeah.
When the Philistines heard that the Israelites had assembled at Mizpah, and the lords of the Philistines marched out against Israel. Hearing of this, the Israelites were terrified of the Philistines, and they implored Samuel, "Do not neglect us, and do not refrain from crying out to the Lord our God to save us from the hands of the Philistines." Thereupon Samuel took a suckling lamb and sacrificed it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried out to the Lord in behalf of Israel, and the Lord responded to him. For as Samuel was presenting the burnt offering and the Philistines advanced to attack Israel, the Lord thundered mightily against the Philistines that day. He threw them into confusion, and they were routed by Israel. The men of Israel sallied out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines, striking them down to a point below Bet-Kar.
Okay, so one of the interesting things here, obviously, is that he makes a sacrifice to Adonai to get Adonai to, engage militarily against the Philistines here, and Adonai then, this text basically talks about Adonai attacking the Philistines. It's not just that the Israelites are attacking. It seems like God is fighting for them. When the Israelites are attacking. And then the men, the men of Mizpah are pursuing them and chasing them away.
Okay. Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen and named it Ebenezer. For up to now, he said, the Lord has helped us. The Philistines.
That may be the origin of a place name. So the place called Ebenezer, and that may be the argument, the story about why it's called Ebenezer. Okay.
Okay. For up to now, he said, the Lord has helped us. The Philistines were humbled and did not invade the territory of Israel again. And the hand of the Lord was set against the Philistines as long as Samuel lived. The towns which the Philistines had taken from Israel, from Ekron to Gath, were restored to Israel. Israel recovered all her territory from the Philistines. There was also peace between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel judged Israel as long as he lived. Each year he made the rounds of Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah and acted as judge over Israel at all those places.
Okay, then those are the big shrines in the north. And Samuel obviously was kind of judging and basically the leader. And you've got an interesting thing. The Israelites are not interested in conquest. So when the Philistines withdrew beyond the area that the Israelites thought was theirs, everything was fine. I mean, that's the idea here, is that's when they achieved some kind of equilibrium and there was peace. Because the Israelites didn't want more territory and the enemy didn't attack them. So, okay.
So then he returned to Ramah, for his home was there, and there too he would judge Israel. He built an altar there to the Lord.
Okay, so we have altars in all of these different places. There's shrines in multiple different places. Samuel goes around as supervisor of these different areas, as the chieftain. And is conducting worship at these different shrines, or at least having others conduct worship at these shrines. But he's building shrines all over the north. The northern kingdom had a lot of different shrines. The south probably had multiple. Well, we know the south had multiple shrines also, but probably not as many. Okay, so when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons judges over Israel. So he's kind of functioning like a king, right? He is kind of functioning like a king anyway. The name of his firstborn son was Joel. His second son's name was Abiah, and they sat in as judges in Beersheba. So now we're in the south. right? I mean, this is Beersheba's way south. These other territories are north in Ephraim. But his sons did not follow his ways. They were bent on gain. They accepted bribes and they subverted justice. Never good. All the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel at Ramah in the north. And they said to him, "You have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore, appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations." I mean, this is what's interesting here is Samuel's sons are hereditary rulers. They might not have the same kind of power, but they seem to be hereditary rulers. And what they're saying is, your sons are not good rulers. We want you to appoint a better ruler that is not you.
And a single leader.
I mean, that's where this is. You know, it's the interesting thing here is it seems like the alternative for Samuel to appoint a king is to have his sons who are bad leaders be the rulers. It is not there. There's no third alternative to that, at least not that's presented in the text, right? Because we know the assumption is that his sons are going to be. He appointed his sons judges, and it seems like his sons are supposed to succeed him, because that's the assumption here. You've grown old, and your sons have not followed in your ways, because otherwise we would be following them. So the alternative here is between Samuel's sons, who nobody wants to follow, and somebody else who he's going to appoint. So it's really an issue of who the successor is here, not whether or not there's going to be a king. It's just the way that the text is presenting it. Okay, so Samuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Possibly because he doesn't like kings, and possibly because he wants his sons to rule.
Right.
Samuel prayed to Adonai, and Adonai replied to Samuel, "Heed the demand of the people and everything they say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king." Okay, actually, it's Samuel's sons they've rejected, which is a whole other interesting thing, right? The text, it should be, they rejected your sons, not you. But having said that, God chose Samuel and Samuel's sons to lead, but was still the king, and now they want a king. So now we're dealing with king replacing God, which is an interesting, that's more along the lines of the Egyptian understanding of the role of a king. The king is the divinity, a kind of divinity, and so this is competition between God and the king.
But it's supposedly God saying that I'm their king.
God so instead of somebody else, you're going to appoint as king. So the difference between king and judge here seems to be in the assumption of divinity, which is an interesting thing, I think, that the assumption here is that a king replaces God, which I'm not sure, obviously at later points in time, that's not true. But we see, divine right monarchy, and we see kings, acting that way. So it's not that far off. But here it's kind of a stark difference between a judge who is not divine and a king who is seen as divine.
But do we really want God, a king, who then would have to interfere on a regular basis to judge people?
But the assumption is that God does do that, right? And in the tradition, that's the assumption, that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked, and God is fighting battles for the people, and God's doing all sorts of stuff, and it's the relationship theoretically that Samuel is in is like Moses, right? He's a prophet, right. He's a mouthpiece for God who is judging, but he's not the ruler as such. Even though he's kind of governing, he's not the ruler. And what the people are saying here is, we want a ruler. We need somebody to be more authoritative. Okay. So like everything else they've done since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them. Samuel reported all the words of Adonai to the people who were asking him for a king. And he said, this will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as chiefs of thousands and fifties, or they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvest, and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves, and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves, your choice young men, your asses, and put them to work for him. He will take 1/10 part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. The day will come when you will cry out because of the king whom yourselves have chosen, and Adonai will not answer you on that day. But the people would not listen to Samuel's warning. No, they said, we must have a king over us. So if you look at these warnings, obviously, some of these things are things that kings generally would do. That they're going to need armies and they're going to need all these people working for them. The question is, what does take mean? Are they literally going to take your daughters away, or are they going to employ them? Are you going to dedicate them to the king? Is he going to just take whatever he wants of your fields and give them to somebody else, or is there some way of governing that's not going to be that way? The 10th part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs sounds sort of like what God commands anyway, right? I mean, God has them giving a 10th part to the temple, right? So there's a certain expectation, I think, involved in this that ends up being very similar to what's going on there. And then he's going to employ all these people, and you're going to finally say enough. So the people wouldn't listen to Samuel's warning. No, they said, we must have a king over us, that we may be like all other nations. Let our king rule over us and go out at our head and fight our battles. When Samuel heard all that the people had said, he reported it to Adonai. And Adonai said to Samuel, heed their demands and appoint a king for them. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, all of you go home. Go to your city. Okay. Go each to your city. Okay.
9.
Yep.
There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah, and a Benjaminite, a man of substance. He had a son whose name was Saul, an excellent young man. No one among the nation among Israelites was handsomer than he. He was a head taller than any of the people. Once the asses of Saul's father, Kish, went astray, and Kish said to his son Saul, take along one of the servants and go out and look for the asses. He passed into the hill country of Ephraim. He crossed the district of Shalisha, but they did not find them. They passed through the district of Shalim, but they were not there. They traversed the entire territory of Benjamin, and still they did not find them. When they reached the district of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, let us turn back, or my father will stop worrying about the asses and begin to worry about us. But he replied, there's a man of God in that town, and the man is highly esteemed. Everything that he says comes true. Let us go there. Perhaps he will tell us about the errand on which we set out. But if we go, Saul said to the servant, what can we bring the man? For the food in our bags is all gone, and there's nothing we can bring to the man of God as a present. What have we got? The servant answered Saul again, I happen to have a 1/4 shekel of silver. I can give that to the man, and he will tell us about our errand.
That's a teeny amount. The 1/4 shekel of silver is a pretty teeny amount. Okay.
Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he would say, Come, let us go to the seer, for the prophet of today was formerly called a seer. Saul said to his servant, a good idea, let us go. And they went to the town where the man of God lived. As they
Okay,
were,
so here, this is an interesting thing, a roe versus a navi. Those are two different terms, and they're saying that they mean the same thing. It's possible that they do. I'm not sure that they actually do. A seer is somebody who kind of divines the future. That would normally be somebody who's doing some sort of hocus pocus that's normally, you would find in a pagan shrine where they're using all kinds of different things and casting them on the ground and then trying to read them and foresee the future. A Navi is a mouthpiece of God, who is being told things by God and then relaying them. That is very different. So the idea that these two are the same is questionable. I think maybe the role, this may be formerly in Israel when a man went to inquire of the divine or of divinities or something like that, of a god. He would say, "Come, let us go to the seer," instead of being of Adonai specifically, because it makes more sense that they would go to the shrine of Asherah or somebody else, and then they would have a seer there as opposed to having an Avi. And that now they're going to say, now you go to an Avi. You don't go to a seer. Okay.
I also have a note from a previous reading of this that the term or the formerly in Israel shows that this was written later than some of the other books.
Yeah, I mean, so it's definitely a scribal note. It is probably an addition to the story at some point, that it seems to be written later than what's before it, but not necessarily, if we've got somebody who's compiling an oral tradition here, it is not necessarily the case that it's written by somebody later than that. It could have been written by somebody at the time that they were doing, that they were just writing this down. What's interesting in that case is the preservation of the term roe, because otherwise you would probably tell the story in such a way that they went to the prophet. They went to the prophet that was there and just go on. You don't include the term roe in the description of what a roe is. So somebody is trying to preserve an earlier story, that's what's going on here. So that one of the things I like about these historical books is that they preserve things that haven't been edited out, and this is one. So what we've got in those early days at those early shrines were roim. They were seers who were looking into the future based on all kinds of weird practices that are later banned. And they would have to say that a seer was a prophet, because otherwise you're dealing with violation of Torah, because the things that a seer would have done are things that are banned in the Torah, at least specifically in Deuteronomy. So that's part of what's going on here. So this note may be later as an attempt to kind of change that idea. Okay.
As they were climbing the ascent to the town, they met some girls coming out to draw water. Girls at the water, that's always a biggie. Mm-hmm. And they asked them, "Is the seer in town?" "Yes," they replied. "He is up there ahead of you. Hurry, for he has just come to the town because the people have a sacrifice at the shrine today. As soon as you enter the town, you will find him before he goes up to the shrine to eat. The people will not eat until he comes, for he must first bless the sacrifice, and only then will the guests eat. Go up at once, for you will find him right away." So they went up to the town, and as they were entering the town, Samuel came out toward them on his way up to the shrine. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed the following to Samuel: "At this time tomorrow, I will send a man to you from the territory of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him ruler of my people Israel. He will deliver my people from the hands of the Philistines, for I have taken note of my people. Their outcry has come to me." As soon as Samuel saw Saul, the Lord declared to him, "This is the man I told you would govern my people." Saul approached Samuel inside the gate and said to him, "Tell me, please, where is the house of the seer?" And Samuel answered Saul, "I am the seer. Go up ahead of me to the shrine, for you shall eat with me today, and in the morning I will let you go, after telling you whatever may be on your mind. As for your asses that strayed 3 days ago, do not concern yourself about them, for they have been found. For whom is all Israel yearning, if not for you and all your ancestral house?" Saul replied, "But I am only a Benjaminite, from the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my clan is the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin. Why do you say such things to me?" Samuel took Saul and his servant and brought them into the hall and gave them a place at the head of the guests, who numbered about 30. And Samuel said to the cook, "Bring the portion which I gave you and told you to set aside." The cook lifted up the thigh and what was on it and set it before Saul. And Samuel said, "What has been reserved is set before you. Eat. It has been kept for you for this occasion, when I said I was inviting the people." So Saul ate with Samuel that day. They then descended from the shrine to the town, and Samuel talked with Saul on the roof. Early at the break of day, Samuel called to Saul on the roof. He said, "Get up and I will send you off." Saul arose, and the two of them, Samuel and he, went outside. As they were walking toward the end of the town, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to walk ahead of us." And he walked ahead. "But you stop here for a moment, and I will make known to you the word of God."
Okay, so
Ooh, big stuff.
so Saul is a nobody here, and Samuel is telling him, that God has decided that he's going to be the one who's going to rule Israel. And he's a Benjaminite. The Benjaminites have a history of being violent warriors. That's their background history, and there are all kinds of problems with the Benjaminites afterwards. The Benjaminites are sitting there southwest of Ephraim, and they're constantly in conflict, probably with the Philistines to their west, Ephraim to the north, and Judah to the south. They have to kind of defend their interests, and they get in battles with all sorts of people. So it's not too surprising that they're the militants who are going to be used to, attack the Philistines, or at least defend against the Philistines. Okay, so Samuel took a flask of oil and poured some on Saul's head and kissed him and said, "Adonai herewith anoints you ruler over his own people." Okay, and this is Meshachacha. Okay, Meshachacha. This is the same as Mashiach. This is the term anoint. That is because up until this point, Saul and his family lineage were not set apart for anything. He wasn't holy at that point. So by doing this, he made him holy. When you leave me today, you will meet two men near the tomb of Rachel in the territory of Benjamin at Zelzah, and they will tell you that the asses you set out to look for have been found, and that your father has stopped being concerned about the asses and is worrying about you, saying, "What shall I do about my son?" You shall pass on from there until you come to the terebinth of Tabor. There you'll be met by 3 men making a pilgrimage to God at Bethel. One will be carrying 3 kids, another will be carrying 3 loaves of bread, and the third will be carrying a jar of wine. It's pretty specific. You're going to see these people and you're going to recognize them by these signs.
Are these like the 3 wise men?
Sort of. I mean, the reality here is what you've got is a specific prediction. Okay. It's not you're going to run into a few people.
Right.
It's not even that you're going to run into 3 people. It's you're going to run into 3 people in this spot, going to this place, carrying this. That's more than enough to make sure that you're going to end up trusting Samuel. Samuel sees everything. That's the thing. I mean, talk about being able to foresee the future. I mean, he can trace Saul's journey right along the way. Everything he's seeing, everybody's running into. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you shall accept. After that, you are to go on to the hill of God where the Philistine prefects reside. There, as you enter the town, you will encounter a band of prophets coming down from the shrine, preceded by lyres, timbrels, flutes, and harps, and they will be speaking in ecstasy. Okay. The spirit of Adonai will grip you, and you will speak in ecstasy along with them. You will become another person. You will be transformed. Once these signs have happened to you, act when the occasion arises, for God is with you. After that, you are to go down to Gilgal ahead of me, and I will come down to you and present burnt offerings and offer sacrifices of well-being. Wait 7 days until I come to you and instruct you what you are to do next. As Saul turned around to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart, and all those signs were fulfilled the same day. And when they came there to the hill, he saw a band of prophets coming toward him. Thereupon the Spirit of God gripped him, and he spoke in ecstasy among them. When all who knew him previously saw him speaking in ecstasy together with the prophets, the people said to one another, "What's happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul too among the prophets?" So, the prophets are people who act really strangely, and they probably were imbibing or smoking who knows what as they're doing all of this stuff. Samuel ends up acting just like them. But another person there spoke up and said, "And who are their fathers?" Thus the proverb arose, "Is Saul too among the prophets?" Okay. So I guess "Is Saul too among the prophets" has something to do with your ability to change who you are. I don't know. Anyway, and when he stopped speaking in ecstasy, he entered the shrine. Saul's uncle asked him and his servants, "Where did you go to look for the asses?" He replied. "And when we saw that they were not to be found, we went to Samuel." "Tell me," said Saul's uncle, "what did Samuel say to you?" Saul answered his uncle, "He told us that the asses had been found, but he did not tell him anything of what Samuel had said about the kingship." Samuel summoned the people to the Lord, to Adonai at Mizpah, and said to them, "Thus said Adonai, the God of Israel, I brought Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians and of all the kingdoms that oppress you. But today you have rejected your God who delivered you from all your troubles and calamities, for you have said, 'No, set up a king over us. Now station yourselves before Adonai by your tribes and clans.' And Samuel brought forward each of the tribes of Israel, and the lot indicated the tribe of Benjamin. Then Samuel, of course, this is really interesting because we know this is fixed, right? So he's kind of acting out the. I mean, there are 2 ways of reading this. One, he's acting out the interpretation of the lots he's casting because he's the one who's interpreting what the lots say to begin with. Or it is that he's actually casting the lots and the results are actually indicating these things, in which case God is directing it. We're not sure which of these it is because we don't have a real indication here that he's necessarily doing this completely randomly. Okay.
Well, he had to find a way that they would all believe what the outcome supposed to be.
Then Samuel brought forward the tribe of Benjamin by its clans, and the clan of the Matrites was indicated. And then Saul, son of Kish, was indicated. But when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So how did he get indicated if he's not to be found? And the indication would literally be to point directly to him. There's no other way that he can be indicated other than being there. So that's a problem. That's an actual problem in the text.
Yeah.
That doesn't work either by the random indication or by Samuel determining what it is. It doesn't make sense that he's not to be found. They inquired of Adonai again, has anyone else come here? And Adonai replied, yes, he's hiding among the baggage. So they ran over and brought him from there. And when he took his place among the people, he stood a head taller than all the people. And Samuel said to the people, do you see the one whom Adonai has chosen? There is none like him among all the people. And all the people acclaimed him, shouting, long live the king. So he's king just because he's tall. That's the answer to that argument. Samuel expounded to the people the rules of the monarchy and recorded them in a document which he deposited before Adonai. Samuel then sent the people back to their homes. Saul also went home to Gibeah, accompanied by upstanding men whose hearts God had touched. But some scoundrels said, how can this fellow save us? So they scorned him and brought him no gift, but he pretended not to mind. Okay, so the other thing of note is Saul is chosen just because he's tall, but we know somebody who's taller who we're going to encounter fairly soon, right? Goliath is taller. And so the issue there is if Goliath is taller, he's more of a king than Saul is. So now we have the issue that that height isn't the determining factor. Something besides height matters. And that's when we get the story of David. You don't have to have the height. Okay, I think we'll stop there for the day. Yeah.
Again, this is someone chosen like Moses, someone who didn't want the position, someone who was not an outgoing, leader type. And here we have Saul, who is very, very similar to Moses.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting scenario here in that you've got Samuel, who doesn't really seem to want any power, but has power, and is super competent. I mean, you don't really have anybody else in the tradition like Samuel. In fact, you could make the argument that of all the people in the Jewish tradition, Samuel is the most righteous, because Samuel doesn't do anything to cause a problem. Everything he does is righteous, and he does everything that God wants. He's the only person in the entire tradition who we don't have any problematic narrative about. Really even more than Noah and Moses. Samuel is the example of righteousness in our tradition. Then Saul is chosen. Saul is chosen by God, which is a really, which makes Saul's failures as king all the more profound. If God is choosing the best person, there's a big problem in that Saul is incompetent. So anyway, that's what we end up with.
Maybe he did that on purpose to show the people that no, you really don't want a king.
Yeah, but then they end up needing a king, and they end up getting David afterwards, right? So the question is, well, why didn't he just choose that at the first place? Now maybe Saul is the best option at the time, but that's a little bit of an interesting narrative here. So we're going to move into the rest of the Saul narrative, and then we'll finally get into the David narrative and then Solomon narrative as we go forward here. So anyway, I think that's it for today. Okay. Enjoy the outdoors.
Yes.
And I will see you soon.
Okay. Take care.